Good evening once again. I am Stephanie Ruhle, and check your calendar because it is day 66 of Trump's war with Iran, and it is unclear where exactly the conflict stands right now. This is what we heard about the situation from the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, earlier today.
The operation is over. Epic Fury, as the president notified Congress, we're done with that stage of it. Okay, we're now on to this project of freedom. The U.S. military is deploying the necessary assets to extend this defensive umbrella over commercial shipping. But there should be no mistake. And as I said this already, this is a defensive operation. I want to reiterate that point. This is important to understand. If no shots are fired at these ships and no shots are fired at us, we're not firing shots. But if we're fired on, we will respond, and we will respond with lethal efficiency.
Tonight on social media, President Trump said Project Freedom will be paused to allow progress to be made in the peace negotiations. But the naval blockade of Iranian ports, well, that's going to stay in place. So far, the operation only successfully escorted 2 tankers through the Strait of Hormuz since it began. That is way lower than the usual volume of ship traffic. And in the past 24 hours, tension in the Gulf has gone in one direction, up, up, up. The Pentagon confirmed Iran has attacked U.S. forces 10 times since the ceasefire took effect, but said that does not reach the threshold to restart combat. And earlier, President Trump was pressed for details about that specific line. Watch this.
What do they need to do to violate the ceasefire?
Well, you'll find out, because I'll let you know. They know what to do, and they know what to do. They know what not to do, more importantly, actually. And, they fired them in little boats with pea shooters, the pea shooters, little boat with little, why? Because they don't have any boats anymore. They should wave the white flag of surrender.
In the meantime, as stocks continue to rise, so does the cost of gas. The U.S. national average of gas is up to $4.48 a gallon. That's a lot more than it was not that long ago. So let's get smarter with the help of our lead-off panel tonight and figure all this out. Alex Ward is here, national security reporter for The Wall Street Journal. Sam Stein, managing editor for The Bulwark and an MSNOW political contributor. And Lieutenant General Mark Hertling, a retired commander of the U.S. Army Europe. And he is now an MSNOW military analyst. Alex, help us understand what this means, because the president paused Operation Freedom to allow for progress in these peace negotiations. Are there any peace negotiations going on?
There are discussions between the Iranians and the Americans that are happening mostly privately. There's a disagreement over the strength of those conversations. Let's put it that way. The Iranians say that there aren't, that not much progress is being made. You have President Trump saying that the Iranians are lying, that actually they are conceding much more in private than they are saying so publicly. But we'll see. I mean, the fact that the president made this move is a signal on his part that that there actually might be some progress, but we'll have to see that in pretty short order. I think the general feeling of this move is that the president was worried the ceasefire would be broken, right? The Iranians were attacking ships. They were attacking the UAE, an American partner, and that there was pressure already in the administration to resume the bombing in order to punish the Iranians for this ceasefire. And one of the things that President Trump said today, in fact, he didn't say this explicitly, but it was quite implicit. He was basically calling for the war to end. What he did say explicitly was, "I don't want to kill more people. We don't want to do that. It's too tough. He doesn't want to kill more Iranians. He would like the Iranians to surrender, so that doesn't have to happen anymore." So I think when you look at a couple of things lining up here, you see the president doesn't want this war to continue. He's worried about the ceasefire being broken, so there would be an escalation of the conflict. Secretary of State Marco Rubio also floated a memorandum of understanding, not a deal. I think you're starting to see some stars to align here, that the president wants out, and that he might at some point quite soon say, "We've done it, I declare victory," and we move on.
Given yes to all of that, but even though all of that, we're still hearing mixed messages from the administration. And yes, Marco Rubio wants it to end. Most likely the president wants it to end. I've spent the last 3 days at the Milken conference with, some of the biggest investors out there, and that's certainly what they're listening for. But Pete Hegseth, he seems to have a different answer, and I want to share what he said in response to a question about the president's demand for an unconditional surrender from Iran. Watch this.
The president hasn't capitulated on anything. He holds the cards. We maintain the upper hand, and Project Freedom only strengthens that hand. And so he will ensure that whatever deal is made or whatever end state is reached creates ensuring that Iran never has a nuclear weapon. He's also been clear, we're not going to entangle this into some nation-building project. Our objectives are clear.
Okay, so before that soundbite, General, when we listened to Marco Rubio, even when we understood the president's messaging, I was like, got it. Then we just heard from Pete Hegseth, and I don't got it anymore. From your perspective, do you think the objectives are clear?
Not between the three people that are talking. We're talking about an end to epic fury. We're talking about a new phase yesterday of Project Freedom, which didn't work at all today. There were no ships going through any of the lanes that were established. There was a pause in epic freedom today, and yet Secretary Hegseth at the same time is saying that there's no capitulation by the president, and he still has all the cards. I'm not sure yet, Stephanie, what cards the president holds. If he's waiting for something, if he's bluffing, if he has an ace up his sleeve that we haven't seen, I'm just not sure what cards give an indicator that there are successful negotiations or there are any movements, because the Iranians said tonight that their blockade continues with ships not being allowed to leave unless they give permission and also charge a fee. So both sides seem to be saying that there's advancement, but there doesn't seem to be any more movement of ships. The other thing that troubles me that hasn't been reported on very much today is Secretary Rubio saying that the War Powers Act is unconstitutional. It is an amendment, and it isn't unconstitutional because several presidents don't like it. And that's basically what the Secretary of State said today. So I'm as confused as you are, Stephanie, and I'm a military guy. I should know better.
Then I feel much better. Okay, Sam, then let's add to the confusion, because Marco Rubio says that Operation Epic Fury is over. Again, that's exactly what Wall Street wants to hear. But do members of Congress see it that way?
No, not all of them for sure. They look at what's happening as a convenient excuse from the Trump administration to not have to deal with a vote on the War Powers Act. There's a 60-day threshold, after which Congress does have to vote on authorizing this war. And if the administration says, well, the operation's over, therefore we don't have to hit that threshold, or we can restart the clock, or however they're putting it, the Democrats in Congress are crying foul. They're saying this is you're basically creating some sort of ex post facto justification for not having a vote. Now, Republicans, by and large, I will say, have basically stood behind the president. There are obviously exceptions, so they're comfortable supporting the president, but they also don't want to have to vote on this. They recognize that it is not politically advantageous to be tied to the war, and that has to do with a lot of reasons. One is obviously the gas prices are out of control. But two, as you've referenced, it's not clear what the actual objectives are here. Project Freedom lasted about 24 hours. The Strait of Hormuz is not open. President keeps talking about getting Iran's nuclear weapons program obliterated. That would ostensibly come through negotiations, but those aren't going particularly well. We've talked about regime change. That has not happened. So it's unclear what the actual objectives are, which makes the members of Congress, including on the Republican side, incredibly skittish about the war in its current state.
Alex, let's stick with the Strait of Hormuz. Break down exactly where things stand, because even if the U.S. continued escorting ships, only a very small number were even getting through.
Yeah, there are just, put it simply, just many ships that still are stuck in that body of water that can't get out. And then, of course, we have to talk about that there are other tankers that do not necessarily want to go, through the channels at any other time. And even if the U.S. were to be doing the escorts, would you take the risk? What are the insurance prices, et cetera? So it's just a really tough economic situation, military situation at this point, and one that is unlikely to resolve soon. If somehow, we could all snap our fingers and the Strait of Hormuz would be open fully today, it would take quite a long time for the resumption of shipping to go through. So this is not only just a current crisis, but whenever this gets resolved, if it gets resolved, it will be a slow-moving recovery, which is maybe something Wall Street does not want to hear. And I think at this point, we're now at, yes, the Strait of Hormuz was open before the war, but it is some kind of Pyrrhic victory, I guess, if the U.S. is able to pry it open from Iran. And you could imagine President Trump saying, I did it, we've done it. But that, is essentially a return to the status quo, even though Iran will be a little more decimated, but that regime will be more hardened and perhaps more likely and more willing to get a nuclear weapon.
General, you actually know what it takes to escort tankers through the strait. Is it a long-term fix if they start it up again?
No, it's not, Stephanie. And first of all, I think we ought to clarify that because there has been nothing noted about escorting ships. They've talked about opening lanes for ship and guiding ships through. So I think that's a little bit of a hedge by the current administration. When you escort ships, you actually are having a cruiser or a destroyer traveling along with merchant ships or convoys of merchant ships, protecting them and giving them overhead cover, having the capability to shoot down missiles that are coming toward the ships and making sure that they go through waterways that don't have any mines. We haven't seen that yet. There have been the establishment of 2 lanes for ships to enter and leave through the strait. But so far, we have seen no ships go through there. This was announced yesterday at the press conference, and still nothing. So when you say the war is over or the epic fury is finished, and you say we're looking at freedom's project, but nothing has happened yet, and you're seeing Iran saying they still don't have any kind of deal that they can talk about because they refuse to give up nuclear weapons, which remains one of the president's main objectives. Again, we used to have something called strategic ambiguity with Taiwan. This is beyond strategic ambiguity. This is just strategic confusion. We don't know what is going on. And from a military analyst perspective, I can't tell you what's happening yet. But I will tell you that if there is convoy escorts or escorts of merchant ships by the U.S. Navy, it's going to take a whole lot more ships than we have there, the cruisers and the destroyers, because you have over 1,000 ships, merchant ships, reported inside the Strait of Hormuz that want to get out. And you can't just put them in a big cubby of oil tankers and escort them with 1 or 2 or 3 destroyers and cruisers. It takes a lot of forces to do that, and we don't have the amount of escorts in the area. This harkens back to the 1980 oil embargo, where there were truthfully escorts, but for a much smaller number of ships and in not as contentious an area where the straits has been closed. It was just dealing with combatants going against merchant ships.
All right, just quickly, while you're hearkening back, I want you to also look from a historical perspective. Are there any short wars that you can point to, right, when they keep saying, this thing's over, this thing's over? Can you think of a time in modern history where a war has lasted 2 months, 3 months, and then it was over?
Desert Storm, the operation in Panama, you had a long-term air campaign of 45 days and then a 4-day ground war, and it brought the Iraqis to heel. Panama was somewhat the same way after we captured Noriega. So those are 2 that I can think of, but truthfully, those had some really strong strategic objectives and some coordinated missions and a holistic approach by the U.S. government. This one has not had those, and that's what's become problematic. It's very easy to start a war. It's very difficult to end one, and it's extremely difficult if you haven't set the conditions through your strategic objectives being met and what you want on your end state.
Sam, it's obviously been a game of chicken. Who can withstand more economic pain? The Guardian is actually asking the question today, will could Iran's escalating economic crisis weaken their negotiating position with the U.S.? Should we be paying more attention to that? This is devastating for them economically.
Yeah, it's tough for me to say. I'm not an expert on the Iranian economy. It's very clear that they, however, don't have a government that necessarily is responsive to the will of the people. They're murderous towards their people. So it's clear that they're not, a representative liberal democracy, and therefore they probably can withstand pain to a degree that a more representative democracy can. Now, I will say, compared to the rest of the world, the United States is fairly insulated with respect to the economic ripple effects of what's happening in Iran. And yet we still are clearly seeing some ripple effects. Jet fuel costs at these prices are having a tremendous impact on consumers. Across the board, you're seeing rising food prices. You're going to see a dramatic spike in travel prices. This is all happening notably, as we're about to embark on the summer travel season, the Memorial Day weekend travel season. It's really going to bite people. Now, Donald Trump seems relatively impervious to feeling this pain, or at least saying that he feels pain. He's constantly talking about how this is a momentary blip, worthy of suffering, so that we can get rid of the Iran nuclear program. But congressional Republicans aren't impervious to this. They're going to start feeling it because they are actually on the ballot. So what I'm looking for is to see when those congressional Republicans finally say, enough. We have to figure out a way to end this war, because Trump clearly recognizes he's not on the ballot this time. He's got other things distracting him, like a ballroom. He's willing to endure this in a way that I don't think everyone in his party is.
Alex, what do you think? Clearly, Iran is suffering a lot from the damage to the blockade, but can they keep going for a while?
Well, they could. I mean, I think Sam makes the right point. This is a murderous regime that doesn't care about its people. It wasn't that long ago that they killed roughly 40,000 or so of its own people as they were protesting the regime. So could Iran do this? I mean, of course they could. I mean, they've also been preparing for this kind of for these kinds of sanctions for a while. Plus, they've been under sanctions for many years. And the one thing you learn about sanctions early on is that the longer you're under them, yes, you suffer, but the more you kind of learn to work around them. And on top of that, the bigger your goal, the less likely sanctions on their own are going to make them happen. So yes, the Iranians could hold out, but we should remember what kind of happened during the COVID years, right? The effects of economic pain were felt around the world far more than they were felt in the U.S. until they were felt in the U.S. And that, of course, caused our own issues. The scenarios are not the same, I want to be clear, but more economic pain, the longer this goes on, is going to reach the U.S. And that's why Trump is in this weird bind. He could try to continue to pressure the Iranians, but that would likely lead to more war and, of course, a prolonged conflict, which could cause economic pain. Or he could try to make some sort of deal and walk away, but that won't be the big thing that he wants, which is some sort of vague super promise that the Iranians will never restart a nuclear program.
All right, gentlemen, thank you for starting us off this evening. We're going to leave it there. Coming up later in the program, how tonight's primary in the state of Indiana is testing Trump's influence with Republican voters. But first, right after the break, money, power, politics. As we said, you know what time it is. Money, power, politics. As investors are back to brushing off the Iran war fears, the Dow climbed more than 350 points and the S&P closed at a fresh record, while oil prices fell, all reacting to strong corporate earnings. And tonight, stock futures climbed after the president claimed that there has been progress toward a deal with Iran. But as usual, good news for the market does not mean good news for the actual economy. Shipping companies said this week that the president's promise of safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz is still not enough to get them to move vessels, while oil executives like the Chevron CEO are also sounding the alarm over the strait. Watch this.
We remain concerned about the security of transit. I've advised people in the administration that the buffers in the system that help ensure supplies are available to markets are being drawn down. And what that does is it creates more upside price pressure, potentially more volatility and more risk.
My colleague Catherine Rampell joins me now. She's co-host of the evening edition of The Weekend and the economics editor for The Bulwark. And Scott Lincecum, vice president of general economics at the Cato Institute. If there is a reason still to be on Twitter, if you were looking for just one reason to still be on it, it's to follow Scott. Okay, Scott, on one hand, we've got the S&P hitting new highs. I've been saying it for the last few days. I spent the last few days at the Milken Institute with investors, and they are all acting like this war was over 6 months ago, 6 weeks ago. We are on to the next. Yet you've got global trade collapsing in the Strait of Hormuz. How do you reconcile this?
Well, I think you reconcile it by thinking of the U.S. economy on two tracks. You have the AI track, that is your kind of tech-driven tailwinds, which are certainly quite strong. We just saw in the recent GDP data that you're still seeing a massive amount of capital expenditures related to computers and electronics and data centers and all that stuff. But then you have the old school economy. Energy, manufacturing, hard materials, aluminum and other metals. And those areas of the economy are struggling. Recent manufacturing surveys from in the ISM reports showed some of the highest input price pressures we've seen since the pandemic. You look at, of course, energy prices and fertilizer shortages. I mentioned aluminum prices. You can go on. So in this kind of hard economy, this kind of old school economy, there's certainly some reasons to be concerned.
Catherine, the president keeps trying to downplay the economic impact of the war. That is something you and I spend a lot of our time fact checking. But tonight, his own Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, he was doing the fact checking. Watch this.
President Trump has made it clear that the U.S. doesn't rely on the Strait of Hormuz. So why should Americans even care about Project Freedom and these shipping tankers going through?
Well, I think on the second point is the one I want to address first, and that is why should Americans care and why it matters to us? Because ultimately these things have an impact on the global economy, which ultimately has an impact on our economy in the long term.
Marco, speaking some truth. What do you think, Catherine?
Well, I'm glad somebody is. Probably he should notify his boss that oil markets are global, right? This is a global commodity. Same thing with fertilizer, same thing with plastics and aluminum and a lot of the other commodities that have been disrupted by this war. You mentioned COVID earlier, I think, before the break, and it does kind of feel like this president is trying to recreate many of the conditions that plagued the global economy back in 2020. Although in that case, it was not of his doing. This time around, it certainly seems like they at least could have foreseen this severing of global supply chains that then get filtered down, through through supply chains to consumers. When you have disruptions in the aluminum market, on top of tariffs for aluminum, which, to add insult to injury, that's going to lead to higher input costs for cars, which means higher prices for consumers. So I'm glad Marco Rubio is acknowledging reality here. I just wish his boss would as well.
Scott, how long before the American consumer feels the full weight of these policy decisions?
Well, I mean, I think they're certainly already feeling it when it comes to gas prices and energy prices. The rest, it's a bit trickier. When you talk about fertilizer prices, well, most analysts expect that will inevitably mean higher food prices, but it probably will take a while for that to actually trickle into the stuff we see at the grocery store. Other things like petrochemicals, plastics, and the rest, that'll come quicker. You expect that just to work its way through the supply chain, and then something we'll see in a couple of months. So, it really will depend on the length of the supply chain and the complexity of the manufacturing. But I don't think there's anybody who doesn't think that even outside of energy, you're going to see a pretty significant increase in the core CPI and the PCE, these inflation gauges for the rest of the year. You're looking at maybe 0.5 percentage point or a little bit more, which doesn't sound like a lot, but when you have a Fed that's shooting for just 2 percentage points overall, that's a lot.
Catherine, you mentioned tariffs. The U.S. trade deficit grew in March by nearly 4.5%. People might not think that's a big deal, but it is. That, of course, was after the Supreme Court struck down President Trump's tariffs. What does that tell you?
Well, look, trade deficits are not really a great measure of anything, in my view, or at least they're not a great measure of whether we are so-called winning or losing on trade, as the president likes to frame the issue. In fact, the periods of recent American history where the trade deficit has narrowed the most have been recessions. Just to give you a sense of whether a bigger or a smaller trade deficit actually even correlates with a strong economy, it's generally the reverse, that when people stop buying stuff because there's a recession, the trade deficit narrows. So in this case, I actually don't think it's that big of a deal. But of course, Donald Trump would say otherwise. This is a metric that he has explicitly targeted as something that he wants to do. He wants to shrink the trade deficit and allegedly even have a surplus. And that's just not going to happen. Certainly, the fact that he keeps on changing tariff rates, even post that Supreme Court decision, makes it much harder for companies that participate in trade to figure out how to time their shipments, and that's going to create more volatility than it otherwise would. But I just think that, Donald Trump is obsessed with this particular metric, but it doesn't really matter all that much to the U.S. economy. Trade deficits are, for the most part, determined by much bigger macroeconomic factors like savings rates and consumption and things like that in different economies.
Well, let's talk about the American consumer, because companies, we see this, Scott, they are racing, some of them, to get their tariff refunds. But you write that it is all but certain the American consumer is never going to get made whole.
Yeah, that's the unfortunate reality. And I think for very good legal and practical reasons, tariff refunds are going to go to the companies that paid them. It'd be pretty much impossible for Uncle Sam to figure out what companies ate the tariffs, what companies passed them on, how they filtered through these complex supply chains. But for you and me, that's cold comfort. The reality is that once prices go up, they rarely go back down. Companies are reluctant to give back price increases they've already taken. And look, you'll see some, I think, good PR moves out there. You saw the company Cards Against Humanity is giving back tariff refunds as a bit of a PR stunt. I think you'll see that. You'll see some business-to-business refunds going through back to either end consumers or other businesses. But as far as making us whole, getting back that full $1,000 that we all invisibly spent last year, good luck with that. And then I think the other big issue with refunds is going to be the smallest businesses. We're already seeing stories out there of really the little guys, the folks that just imported a few $1,000 last year, but are owed several $100s or $1,000. They don't know how to operate, how to navigate these rather bureaucratic systems. And they, even though they paid the tariffs directly and should be getting a refund, even they might not be getting anything.
And the system is banking on that. My sadness is that we have run out of time. I wanted to talk about the new price tag for the ballroom and that companies and the president are covering the costs. It's likely going to be you and me, but we're out of time. Scott, Catherine, thank you both for joining us tonight. When we return, very few Republicans defy Trump, but a handful in Indiana did it when it came to his redistricting push, so he threw his support behind their opponents. But does a Trump endorsement pack the punch it once had? When I talked to him last, he said it certainly did. It's why he was endorsing candidates overseas now. In case you didn't know, and if you didn't, don't sweat it. A lot of people didn't. It is Election Day. And tonight we get a glimpse into how strong the president's hold is on his party. Key primaries were held in multiple states, including Ohio, Michigan, and most crucially, Indiana. The president endorsed challengers to 7 sitting Republican state senators who rejected the administration's pressure campaign to redraw Indiana's map back in December. And at least 5 of those Trump-backed candidates beat the incumbent. Here now to discuss, Dave Weigel. He's a political reporter for Semaphore and a dear friend of this show. Dave, explain these results. What was your takeaway?
This on the higher end of what Trump and his allies were hoping for, and he had a lot of allies. It wasn't just the president weighing into these races. The Club for Growth rushed in. Jim Banks, the senator from Indiana, spent money on this. Turning Point Action, Charlie Kirk's group, they were on the ground chasing ballots. This is a effort to show strength in Indiana, have that strength kind of radiate throughout the state so that the next Indiana majority does gerrymander the state, does eliminate 2 Democratic seats, and then outside Indiana say, do you want the fate of these Hoosiers to happen to you? If you are in a Republican state and you have the ability to eliminate Democratic districts, do it, or Trump is going to come after you.
All right, well, let's talk about what voters are doing, because Tennessee is beginning a special session to redraw their own congressional maps, and I want to share how voters there are reacting.
People fought and died for the right to vote and the right to be represented fairly. And Tennessee was a hotbed of activity for the Voting Rights Act and equal representation. And it's going down the toilet.
The idea that we're going to dilute our black vote so that the GOP will have more representatives in Congress is ridiculous, because there's no reason why all Tennesseans should not be represented, because the Constitution still exists.
It's important that not only do I maintain the right to vote, but my students who haven't turned 18 yet will be able to maintain their right to vote over the next several decades here in Tennessee, because it's their home too, and they don't have the opportunity to be here today, but I do, and I'm going to stand up for them.
Dave, Trump and Republicans clearly started this redistricting fight in hopes that it could tilt the scales in their favor. Has it backfired among voters? Or is this to be careful what you wish for, in some states at least?
Well, it only backfired because some Democrats took a risk. They took a risk in California and then in Virginia in putting new maps in front of voters and winning. And the Virginia one is tied up with Republican lawsuits, but Democrats still expect that to prevail. Had they not acted, I mean, this is a radicalizing event that Trump engineered. Had the Democrats not acted, it would have been a huge benefit for Republicans. And the recent benefit, which is the reason Tennessee can go back and do this, was the Calais decision, was the Supreme Court coming up with a very difficult test for using Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act to draw majority-minority districts. So we're all who cover politics trying to keep track of how Republicans are moving on this. There is a lot of work being done by Republicans in the states, but also by Republican senators in D.C., by the Justice Department, in trying to find ways to force states to redraw their maps and, based on the Supreme Court's text, eliminate seats that were going to vote automatically for Democrats. This is a discussion in the South. There are states that can't move this year, but are talking about moving in 2028 so that, for example, Alabama, which has 2 majority-minority seats, might go down to 1 or 0. The Mississippi, you already see Mississippi Republicans saying they can eliminate the Voting Rights Act seat in the Mississippi Delta and Jackson, replace that with Republican seats. It backfired in places where Democrats could fight back. They do not have the resources to fight back in most of the South. It's not backfired there. They're just kind of trapped Democrats in a canyon.
All right, well, then let's talk about Louisiana specifically, because the Supreme Court allowed its redistricting rules on the state's congressional maps to go into effect immediately. What does that mean? What can we see here? Well, the first impact that you saw was the governor canceling the elections that were going to happen until they can have new districts drawn. This Louisiana ended up being the plaintiff in this case, so they were always going to move if the decision came early enough in the cycle, and it really did land with the Supreme Court's discretion, with, I should say, Sam Alito's discretion. It landed in a maximally chaotic period, too late to influence normal redistricting cycles because of when state legislators meet, late enough to affect what some states are doing. You remember it landed right when Florida was arguing that it needed to draw new maps and to get right with the voting with the new interpretation that was coming of the Voting Rights Act. And so in Louisiana, yes, this was expected. Republicans right now they were talking more about eliminating the New Orleans seat, creating a Baton Rouge-based seat that would probably vote for Democrats. But again, in 2028, it's a Republican enough seat where you can draw lines that slice up cities, slice off the African-American vote, which in the South, no matter what the Supreme Court says, African-American vote remains overwhelmingly Democratic. The white vote remains overwhelmingly Republican. You can, and Republicans have already started draw seats in these places that are going to vote Republican. So Louisiana is going to move the ball halfway down the field this year. Everyone expects probably all the way down in 2028. My goodness, and we'll be watching. Democracy, where is it going? Mr. Weigel, thank you for joining us tonight. When we return,
thank you.
Something you might not be paying attention to, but it's worth it. We're going to look at the president's quiet war on dreamers. My next guest spoke to DACA recipients who are facing
संबरी जीरी मुरी दा संगते बेलिरिंद पुटरे पल्ला मनाजीर साई बिलदे तसड़ दार संगता साई रोशे पका होए खवै बेली मड़ बेसवी मड़ दे देने जी एदा बोर बारगे सिंगार थगा बेली दे मखनो धीरे दे हाँ जी साईं से भी है बर केवला हाँ जी साईनी के शिकारा गढ़तगो बेली राजा के मार तुन्ना जादानी साई मीरचा करो सरदार मनी साई आफा मथा डोला बरो बेली गोश्ता मुरी दे बुल गोदानी साई मीरचा करो सरदार मनी एदा मंगो थई मंगारवा साई तक गुड़ दे हानी या बरानी एदा हानी मलूक जानी दगे माझी मता से देख दे एदा आफे कदा इर्गिश्त गांजी साईं बूचो खुदो आवता गांजी बेली आफ मलू का वार्तगा आफ आफ दिलार जीवार्तगा एदा गिंद बदी बेअकुला आपके मुरीदा वार्तगा साईं को कारतगो आप कष्टगा जी सरवाने मजा शाहे शाहे दस्त तीर दाना जरा जल्दी जल्दी तीन आख्तों के तल मले टेके टेके शपुरंगाज मोर वदरे होशे होशे गड़तगा मले सा जले रंदानी जीवात से हक स्यादे स्यादे हिड़हाल वाल के तो हाल वरी दाते दाते मर को हाल छे रवा दाते दाते आलमा कुला हैर मेर बीता बीता कब तक वो कारी है सदो माहे माहे लाल सदो बच्ची दो रखा भी मारे शोहाजे झवे नोखे नोखे ढडर आवी तो जगर स्याहे स्याहे दकुड़ी यानो सोख्तगा पानात पानात आसदा चोटिया खड़ो बीता बीता मेहड़ा यलट्टे खाना पीरई गोरमा सगिस गोख पीरई जीवाते मुलिद आजुए खुदे केस्तां मनदा जाने हर शसे हत्यार जन गोतेगा चौटवी काटार काटार मलगो मोची रखतगे संजा काटुश खैराता न हो से तायरा इकुले दरगाह कबूल बिया मावदी दोस्ता